So, Walle, just a moment ago we were talking about the obsolescence of painting. Not really painting, but what comes to mind is another sort of topic of obsolescence. The Sublime.
Yeah, the Sublime is also very obsolete.
Exactly.
Perhaps more, well...
There was a time then when the Sublime was spoken about a lot.
Yeah, it was one of those concepts that was all over the place, and it pretty much the same time as this debates on painting in the early 80s. And I think it was largely connected to one single person, Jean-François Lyotard, who published an essay in Art Forum in the early 80s, 81, 82, something like that, called The Sublime and the Avant-Garde, where he claimed that on a reading of Kant, but also Bonnet Newman, where he was saying that the Sublime was like the driving force behind modernism, and because Lyotard was all over the place, his book on the postmodern had just arrived a couple of years earlier, and the postmodern was the thing. And for him, it's very important to recognize that for him, modernism was in a certain way a cooling down of the avant-garde, because the avant-garde was still continuing in the postmodern, and the Sublime was the search for the unpresentable, the impossible, the incongruous, the paradoxical, which somehow drove art ahead, whereas modernism as a kind of institutionalized form was a way of fending off the experience of the Sublime. So for him, postmodernism was avant-garde and was connected to the Sublime. So I think his authority or his presence, his fame, made the Sublime into a overused and inflated concepts. There were so many books written on the history of the Sublime, etc., etc. But today, I mean, it's not used a lot. But I mean, I think what the term points to is something that I hope will not go away from. From neither philosophy nor art. I mean, if one looks at the history of the concept, I mean, it goes back. I mean, the Sublime is an English word. It's called das Erhabene in German, the Sublime in French. So there are various ways to use the term, but I mean it goes back to a Roman writer who wrote in Greek. We don't know really if he existed. He was called Longinus, and perhaps he didn't even exist, so we call him Pseudo-Longinus. But he wrote a treatise somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century AD called Perihypsos. It's normally translated as on the elevated, lofty style. But he was drawing on rhetoric, actually, and for him the Sublime was a moment in language when you speak. And since he was working on rhetoric, for him the Sublime was a trick, right? And he would say that a writer who's beautiful, who's perfect, like Plato, who produces these long, complex, beautiful lines of Greek, he's beautiful, it's great, but it's not sublime. Because the Sublime signals something like a cut in language, a tear in the fabric of words. It is when a speaker, produces this eloquent talk, flowing, and suddenly there's this moment where he stops, where he begins to stutter, where language fails him. And then this is the moment when you feel that there is something so great that it cannot really be expressed in words. And for Longinus, this is a trick, man. He works in rhetoric, so you can actually produce this thing by saying, I need to say that. So it's a trick you can play on your audience. It's not only a trick, of course, but I mean, you can actually produce the Sublime. But he also finds literary sources for it in Genesis, in the Bible, for instance, and he says that, the first, at least in Latin now, fiat lux, that would be light, 2 words. There are 2 very simple words, let fiat lux. But what they signify is the emergence of the whole visible world. So there is this absolute difference between the paltriness and poverty of these 2 words in Latin and the emergence of the whole world. So the Sublime is about a difference. And so this is, of course, not a trick, right? This is more like on the level of content. And so the Sublime somehow was then transported under different names in Latin and other languages through the Middle Ages. It often had to do with the difference between the divine and the earthly, and there are painters who would work on showing this difference in the work, like Fra Angelico, for instance. There's a fabulous book by Georges de Huberman French art historian called Les Semblances et Figurations, where he's trying to show that you know, in Fra Angelico's work you find the depictions, the figurations, and then you have the surfaces of paint, or the blotches, the stains. And the stains indicate the difference between the infinity and the finite. So I mean, this wasn't called the Sublime, but I mean, it's the same problem, in fact, because this infinity is somehow marked by the absolute scratch on the surface of the painting. And so the Sublime is always there under different rubrics. Interesting enough, it re-emerges as a term, and it becomes called the Sublime. It acquires a name of the Sublime in a very surprising moment in the late 17th century. You know, Nicolas Boileau, who's mostly known for being the theorist of French classicism, you know, the unity of the drama, etc., the rules, wrote his Art Poétique, which is a book of rules, how to produce poetry. And he also translated Longinus and called it in French du sublime. This is how the term sublime enters modern languages. So as Lyotard says, it's a kind of counterbound text. You know, you have the theorist of the academy, of the rules, of the law, and then you have the theorist of disorder. And he would refer to Pindar, the Greek poet, where you find this sublime syntactical disorder of the Greek, which like shatters language, and you don't know read backwards or forwards. Sublimity is a moment when language comes apart. And then it moved in the 18th century into English landscape painting, and it was all over the place in the 18th century, often connected to genius. And Kant picked it up in the Critique of Judgment. And I mean, for Kant, the Sublime, and he gives these vivid descriptions of the Sublime, which he picks up from the whole discourse of landscape painting, poetry in the 18th century. But says, you know, for Kant, it is an ethical concept. It is that in beauty, we find ourselves connected to the world. We find this sense of a fit, you know, between our concepts and the objects. And beauty,
what? Sorry?
You know, maybe you said I have these concepts that I want to describe the world, and beauty is a kind of precognition. It is a moment in cognition when I feel that my concepts fit the world. There's a fit between concepts and world, and beauty is not really yet knowledge, but it points in the direction of knowledge. So it's a kind of epistemological concept somehow. It is a ground of knowing the world. The Sublime, and it shows that we belong in this world. We feel at home in the world. The Sublime says no. And Lyotard says, no, beauty is like childhood. You feel that you're in the world, you belong to the world belongs to you. Suddenly there's a moment when you say no. The moment of you become an adult. You know that you have to do other things. The moment of ethics. You have to say to yourself, this is a world, but I also have a responsibility. So the Sublime is the moment of ethics for Kant. And he portrays it by drawing on Burke and many others from the 18th century, the vastness of the mountains, the sky, the raging storm in the ocean. And Kant says that in those moments we feel that we are infinitely inferior to nature. My body is nothing. I can be destroyed at any moment in time. But on the other hand, I am a feeling is produced in me, which is the feeling of the Sublime, is that I'm also infinitely superior to nature because I'm free. I have an ethical responsibility. And regardless of what nature is, nature can never take away my freedom from me, my duty to respond to the categorical imperative. So the Sublime is about ethics, which, as Kant says, the Sublime cannot really be captured in art, because art always preserves the measure of the human body, of the hand. The art can never shake us in the way that a storm or a volcano can do. Even though Kant uses examples from art, but he explicitly denies that Sublime belongs to art. Of course, after Kant, people said, no, this is all wrong. So Schelling, Schiller, and many others, Hegel, drew the Sublime back into art and said that Sublime can absolutely also be captured in art in certain ways. And from that point on, the Sublime traverses the whole of modernity, and as a contrast to somehow beauty. So beauty and Sublime they are two facets of our experience of the world and of art. And when Lyotard picks it up, he does it, so I mentioned Longinus, but also Bonnet Newman, who's, I think, his most important source at that moment anyway. Bonnet Newman was, of course, he was trying to reinvent painting the moment after the Second World War. There was a sense of loss of the European tradition, the atomic bomb, sense of nihilism. Where are we going? So there was a symposium in New York in 1948, and people were called upon to comment on Longinus' text. That was actually the pretext for the whole thing. But Newman mentions Longinus, but he gave this talk called "The Sublime is Now," where he said that's the sublime, and it's for us Americans, because for him it's now in opposition between Europe and America. The sublime is about in a sense of emptiness and void, because the tradition has been annulled. But there's also a sense of this emptiness presenting me with an absolutely unconditional imperative. Now, here, where am I? Where am I in this void? So this is why his paintings, and some of them are called, be, here, now, there, all these indexical terms that point to the presence of someone in time. And so there's this absolute address coming from art. And for many of those who would interpret Newman, this, of course, is the classical male, phallic painter, etc. And that's probably true in the case of Newman. But for Lyotard, I mean, those indexical markers, the be, there, here, now, they signal something else. They signal the fact that we are always trying to capture something of a present moment that eludes us. So for him, the sublime is not at all about this kind of modernist, male, phallic, heroic tradition. It's about trying to capture something that eludes us in the present, because the present always disappears. So it's a kind of temporal experience in the sublime, of the now disappearing, which is why he often says the sublime is not about grandeur, it's about almost nothing happening, the almost nothing happening, which is almost impossible to capture. And philosophy and art for him are two ways of responding to this address which always eludes us. And he calls that the sublime, and maybe he should have chosen another word, I don't know. But I mean, for him it's about, there are rules and there are institutions, there are discourses, there are rules from Boileau to the present. There will always be rules of engagement, rules of discussion, rules of discourse, rules for making art. Art will always be taught in academies. But there is also something that escapes the rules. And without that, no rules will make any sense. So we have to continually attempt to account for that which escapes rules and always fail. We will always fail. So the sublime is about this constant failure of grasping that which touches us. So in that sense, the sublime, regardless of the term, I should hope that it wouldn't go away, because that would mean that art and philosophy would become a rule-bound activity, like the way it is in academia or in art schools. But there has to be something else. And there's another term for that which is very present from the Italian Renaissance and onwards, and it goes back to Quintilian Roman rhetoric. Specifically in the Italian Renaissance, we say, okay, you can do everything by the book, right? You can do everything by the book. And the rules, as Vasari would say, there's a rule of art, the perfetta regola d'arte. You can learn everything, but still it wouldn't be good. There has to be something else. The I know not what, il non so che. Diderot would translate that, le je ne sais quoi. And without that, you cannot do art. You can do art, but it wouldn't be any interesting. So there has to be something, you don't know what it is, and that's what somehow touches us. And that's very close to the sublime in that sense.
No, right. I remember just a lecture that you gave some time ago when you mentioned this painter who made a rift in the corner.
Yeah.
That was...
Yeah, it's a story that I often use. I don't know if it's actually true or not. Maybe I just invented the whole thing. But I mean, if I invented it, it's so good that it should exist.
It's a good story.
A good story. And as I remember it, it's referred to the Italian painter Federico Zuccari or Zuccaro. There are two spellings of his name. He was the president of the Florentine Academy, and he actually said that we should actually close the academy. He said, because art cannot be taught, and if we could teach art, it would be dead. But he didn't close it because he was the president of the academy, so he kept it going. But he wrote interesting text on that. And as I remember it, he also made one of his paintings is about the Judgment Day, and it shows this landscape with sheep and pastors and shepherds and mural fragments, whatever, classical Arcadian landscape. And there is this sky, and there's a small tear, a small rift in the sky, and we know. It's called the Judgment Day. We know that in a second that the heavens will come apart and God will descend and Judgment Day will come, but it hasn't happened yet. So we just know that this peaceful Arcadian scenery will be shattered completely in a second. But we only see this because of this small tear in the sky. So the sublime would be about this difference between what we see and what we think. And had he shown the heavenly armies descending upon us. Perhaps it would have been beautiful or frightening, but not sublime. So sublime is about this kind of minuscule difference.
And quite scary.
Scary, but not scary. It's also a moment of tension, you know. Now, it's Kant in one of his descriptions of the sublime. It's almost sexual, like an orgasm. You know, it's a moment of checking. Your emotions, your vital forces are suspended for a second, and then the complete release of those forces again. You know, and that's an orgasm, of course. But Kant says the sublime thing is neither the check, the suspension, nor the release, but is the cut. It's the cut in time, and that's the sublime. Afterwards, it may be pleasurable, which is lust, which is of course pleasurable, and after that maybe pain. But sublime is this kind of weird mixture of pleasure and pain. It is a kind of pleasure that can only be acquired through a sense of displeasure, and it is precisely in this spasm you find the sublime.
Anticipation, maybe.
Anticipation.
Exaltation.
Anticipation and then release, but at the precise moment when you have neither anticipation or release, but the transition, which is always lost. This is why Lyotard says that in a certain way he refers to Freud, the sublime only comes after. He says the sublime experience as a sense of moment in time that is lost. And he uses Freud's term, Nachträglichkeit, something that occurs afterwards. Sublime is like a trauma, because you can only describe it afterwards, but the description will always lose this evanescent moment in time when the sublime occurs. So it's about that, and I think philosophy has to do with that, art has to do with that, and we shouldn't lose it. And the term sublime is perhaps less, it's a historical term that we can use or not. So the term may go out of fashion, but the experience as such is a profound human experience, and I don't think we should lose that.